Psych 364 students. This is my second video for week 5, and we turn now from the topic of existential and phenomenological perspectives on the inner workings of men's lives to the contributions from developmental psychology. And here I want to significantly divert from your text, meaning that Smiley and Kilmartin, in my view, do not sufficiently address the developmental perspective in understanding the inner life of men and boys. Specifically, if you go back to chapter 4, you will see some reference to age as a factor in the psychology of men and boys, and of course it is. It's not a singular causal factor, but I like Erikson's theme of the seasons of life that we can benchmark or bookmark, if you would, in terms of some approximations of age. So all that being said, I would like this week for you to look at developmental psychology's contribution as a supplement to Smiley and Kilmartin's more narrow presentation of developmental issues in chapter 4. I will say, in my opinion, that Kilmartin and Smiley emphasize a predominantly sociocultural or social learning perspective in understanding the changes in men's inner experience as a function of their aging and development. I would like us to take a more multifactorial or multi-causal perspective and look at the variety of biopsychosocial factors that are involved. Now, more specifically, let me take you again to our modules, and in that our weekly folder, because I have a limited aspiration here in what I know is a complicated set of materials. In our week 5 folder, you'll notice, and you've already found this video, so right beneath this video are two what I consider to be required supplementals in understanding developmental contributions to the inner life of men and boys, not sufficiently covered in our text. The first of these is the 7 developmental stages of man, and this is a New York Times article. Came out a long time ago, actually, just at the turn of the century, but it's in its simplicity, I think it gives us a reasonable framework. We could similarly look at Erik Erikson's stages of development, and indeed that is a useful approach. I do want to introduce you to, and you won't be tested on this, but it'll be helpful in your essays, the 10 theorists that I would think students ought to have been introduced to by the time they've looked at developmental psychology, which is a 300-level course, or even introductory psychology. So let me show you my own notes on this, and then if you're taking notes, you might find this to be of value. The 10 theorists that I think have influenced my own thinking about developmental contributions are here, and I'll comment very briefly on each. I will say, by way of credentialing myself just a bit, is that I have a long history as a clinical psychologist working with families and adolescents. I also have a fairly long history in terms of teaching developmental psychology, and in the spring I'll be teaching the psychology of adulthood and aging. So all that being said, in my view, the contributors who I think students in this course, Psych 364, should have some familiarity with begin, of course, with Erik Erikson, and I'll highlight these as I go through for your benefit. Erikson stages of development are probably the best known in the field of developmental psych, and they provide a good framework that's similar to the framework found in this New York Times article. I think the New York Times article more directly addresses somewhat dated scientific knowledge on the psychological correlates of men and boys at these stages. Going back even further, of course, Freud and Carl Jung developed distinctive positions on the development of males and females. Probably lesser known to many undergraduate students is the work of Alfred Adler and Karen Horney. These are two other neo-Freudians or students of Freud. I would strongly encourage you at least look them up in Wikipedia, find images of them perhaps. But these are the early developers, meaning the 20th century developers of the psychology of men from a predominantly psychoanalytic perspective. Now, that being said, the value of the psychoanalytic perspective is not its accuracy, but rather its methods of using introspection and reports, subjective reports of psychiatric patients as a data source in developing a understanding of the inner minds of men and boys at different ages. So again, I would think an undergraduate would at least be familiar with Freud, Jung, Karen Horney, and Alfred Adler as early contributors to the psychodynamics of men and boys. Erik Erikson is another 20th century student of Freud's, more directly a student of Anna Freud's actually, and he and Joan Erikson, whom I want to underline, developed the marvelous framework which is now a centerpiece of developmental psychology. And again, I would encourage you to look at, you can easily find Joan and Erik Erikson's stages of development as a framework for our discussion. Erikson differed, as all of Freud's students did, passionately from Freud's initial formulation. And he and Karen Horney and Alfred Adler and Carl Jung were those, how am I going to say, independent-minded students who modified our understanding of the psychoanalytic development of gender. I would underline Adler in particular insofar as he emphasized inferiority and the need for power as major dynamics in the inner life of men and boys. These are echoed by Smiley and Kilmartin, Ron Levant, and others. So this issue of power certainly is one that we want to be looking at in the next few weeks front and center as an inner drive in the need structure of men and boys. In the more contemporary era, which means living and contributing still, I want to acknowledge Carol Gilligan and Nancy Chodorow, who are contemporary faculty, both affiliated with Harvard University. Chodorow is mentioned in your textbook and is a major item on your essays, I hope. I'm going to pause because there's a noise outside. Okay, resuming again. I was mentioning living and predominant contributors to the inner study of the inner lives of men and boys, and I said that Carol Gilligan, focusing on the early moral development of men and girls, men and boys, women and girls, is certainly front and center in my thinking about the psychodynamics of men and boys. Nancy Chodorow is in your text, and I would certainly hope you look carefully at her work. I think some of her contributions to understanding the differential relationships of men and their mothers and women and their mothers is very helpful. And then, of course, the work of George Valiant, who has done the most well-known longitudinal studies on the development of men in adulthood, which is to say young, middle, and late adulthood. And finally, certainly a predominant speaker of the field, from the field, is Ron Levant, who you will come to next week as you read our next chapter on emotionality in men and boys. Now, the only one that I have left out is the work of Judy Chu. And Judy Chu is a student of Carol Gilligan's, and I want to show you her book. It should appear here, and I'll make it larger. This is the work of Judy Chu, and for those of you who are interested in the inner life of preschool boys and elementary school boys, this is, in my mind, a wonderful contribution to the field that was published about 4 years ago. And she does qualitative studies on changes in the experience of boys as they discover their masculinity years ahead of the issue of puberty. So I would certainly add her as a contemporary. Here in a link to that image, which is from goodreads.com, is a wonderful summary of her book if you don't have the time or inclination to look at it carefully. So here's what she says, and I just think it's a wonderful summary of how far we've come from Freud's day to the modern era. She writes, or I should say goodread.com writes, when Judy Y. Chu first encountered the 4-year-old boys we met in this book, they were experiencing a social initiation into boyhood. They were initially astute in picking up on other people's emotions, emotionally present in their relationships, and competent in their navigation of the human social world. However, the boys gradually appeared less perceptive, articulate, and responsive, and became more more guarded and subdued in their relationships as they learned to prove that they are boys, primarily by showing that they are not girls. So in a way, this is one explication of homophobia as a common developmental challenge in Erikson's framework that young boys encounter. So those of you who are, again, interested either because of your children or your career aspirations in thinking about working with young boys and developing accurate empathy, I strongly recommend that you look at this as a supplement to our very cursory exploration in Smiley and Kilmartin this semester. So, okay, I'm back, and I'm approaching the 14-minute mark. So I'll leave it at that, although there's much more, of course, that can be said about this rich perspective on the inner lives of men and boys. I'll look to your questions and discussions on the discussion board, or your one-to-one conversations if you want to explore this material in greater depth. Thanks for your attention.